Hello, friends. Not only am I away from the keyboard, the piano keyboard that is, I am away from home. I'm not going to tell you exactly where I am, I'll just say that this is one of my favorite places to be, except that there is no piano here. And that always takes my musical productivity down a few notches. Actually, there was a piano here years ago, a Steinway upright, but it was always in hilariously awful condition with being right next to the ocean and not having any humidity control. I think it had also sustained some damage in the nor'easter of 1991. But there were 4 or 5 keys in the bass that sounded like a harpsichord. The B-flat above middle C didn't sound at all. And there were a bunch of other quirks that I don't remember. But there was one time when I tried to write a piece of music that would take advantage of all these specific quirks for musical effect. There was a project which would have warmed the cockles of John Cage's heart. But it was not an instrument on which you could hope to get done much serious playing. And anyway, there is no piano here now. And so the question is, well, what do you do with yourself when you don't have a piano? Well, one thing you can do, and this may sound radical, but it's actually quite important, one thing you can do is just not worry about music at all. Relax, do some physical exercise, enjoy being outdoors, or find some good books to read. I recently finished reading the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which I would highly recommend to anyone. But if you're trying to be specifically musically productive, there are a handful of things you can do. For example, if there are pieces of music that you're trying to work on, you can bring along recordings of that piece to listen to. What's best is if you can bring along 2 or 3 or 4 recordings of the same piece by different artists, so you can get the sound of different interpretations into your head. Another thing you can do is bring along music scores and just study it and try to memorize the piece. Some of this is about fixing the sound of the music in your head, but what's even better is if you can concentrate hard enough to get the muscular movements in mind. Even though you're away from the keyboard, just try to remember all the finger motions, hand motions, arm motions, the whole body. And if you can fix all of that in your mind and go over it repeatedly away from the piano, then when you come back to the piano, you'll probably find that all of it has gotten just a little bit easier. Or what's even better, if you can do this, if you don't happen to have any recordings handy or scores, but just find a quiet place to be and imagine yourself playing the piece of music or just a short passage from it, from beginning to end, and recall every muscle movement that goes into it and all the sounds that you're trying to make, every single note. And if you can take a passage like this and run over it in your head away from the piano, and then come to the piano later, even if it's a few days later, and check yourself, are those muscle movements in fact going to create those sounds? That's a very good exercise. There's also the question of what you do when you're a composer and you're used to working at the piano. Now, there's actually a school of thought among composers that it's better to compose away from the piano so that you don't become dependent upon it. In fact, Hector Berlioz was quite proud of not needing to be at the piano. He was proud of not knowing how to play the piano. And I think John Philip Sousa also shared this attitude. But then there are also composers who not only are willing to acknowledge that they're dependent on the piano, but they kind of make it a point of being proud of not being proud of composing away from the piano. I think Stravinsky was like this. I definitely am much better at composing when I have a piano where I can try stuff out immediately. But there's still stuff you can do away from the piano. And it all comes down to different phases of composing. There's the phase where you're just gathering ideas, and this is where you get Beethoven walking around with his sketchbook, and he would just write down anything that popped into his head or anything that he'd hear. And I don't think I ever completely understood what he was up to. I figured what he must do is he would go, oh, so this melody makes me think of these woods, and he'd write it down. So what I would always do is I would come out here by the water, and I'd sit watching the waves crashing against the rocks, and I'd have my sketchbook, and I'd try to come up with a melody that would suggest the ocean. And I'd sit here for 2 or 3 hours, and suddenly I'd realize, oh my goodness, I've just spent 2 or 3 hours being hypnotized by the waves, but I haven't come up with any music. I think the most music I ever came up with while I was out here was when a duck started quacking right next to me, and I thought, oh, that's kind of musical. And I wrote down the notes that the duck quacked, and then I was able to work it into a piece of music. But in terms of writing music that would evoke this ocean scene, what would more often happen is that I would spend time here by myself or with other people, and then I'd go home, and it would be in remembering the time spent here that I'd come up with something. But like I said, there are different phases to composing. There's the idea gathering phase, and then there's the experimentation phase. And that's a little bit like scientific experiments. You start out with some little observation or hypothesis, and then you just follow it and see if you can figure out where it leads. And it might look good on paper, but then you actually do the experiment and it doesn't work out. So then you go home and you try it on the piano, and oh, that doesn't sound as good as I thought it would. Or, oh, I thought this was going to sound stupid, but it actually sounds really nice. If you're away from the piano, there really isn't a secret here. All you can do is just write down as many ideas as you can come up with. And when you get back to the piano and try them out, well, maybe 90% of them are going to sound like crap, but the other 10% might be promising. Anyway, those are some things to keep in mind when you're away from the piano. I should be back at the keyboard next weekend, so see you then.